I had planned the hike for months, spending evenings poring over maps and reading trail reports. The forest I chose was dense, with ridges and hidden valleys, a place people talked about in hushed tones as untamed. That word was the main lure for me, the sense of stepping somewhere unmarked, untouched, and dangerous enough to feel real. I had hiked alone before, but never this far into a wilderness that had very little cell reception and no maintained trails. I packed carefully, enough water, food, a first aid kit, a flashlight, an extra battery, and a heavy-duty knife strapped to my belt. I left my car at the trailhead at dawn, the early sunlight slicing through the mist that hung low over the parking lot. The initial climb was straightforward. The path was steep, but well-worn in patches, dotted with fallen leaves and twisted roots. Early on, the forest was alive with bird calls and the soft rustling of small animals. I felt comfortable. I told myself that the isolation was part of the draw. There was a strange beauty in the way the sunlight hit the moss on the rocks, the way the air smelled damp and earthy. But as I ascended, the trail began to fade. Signs of human traffic disappeared. Only broken twigs and faint, indistinct marks in the dirt suggested anyone else had passed this way recently. Around midday, I reached a ridge that overlooked a small, hidden valley. The view was stunning. Green canopy stretching endlessly, a river cutting through the foliage far below. But there was also a sharp drop near the edge. I moved cautiously, testing each step before committing my weight. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in. Sunlight became patchy, filtered through thick branches and large, dark leaves. My pack felt heavier. The temperature dropped subtly, and the wind had an almost whispering quality as it threaded through the treetops. I made my first real mistake here, moving off what little trail remained. A combination of arrogance and curiosity drove me. The map suggested a hidden waterfall was nearby, tucked away in a side ravine, and the idea of finding it alone thrilled me. The ground underfoot was uneven, loose, and slick with fallen pine needles. One wrong step could send me tumbling down the slope. I didn't realize at the time how quickly the terrain could shift from challenging to perilous. Branches snagged at my backpack, and I had to crouch under fallen trees that blocked the narrow path. My legs ached from twisting and balancing on rocks, and a bead of sweat ran down my spine despite the cool air. By mid-afternoon, I had reached the ravine. The waterfall itself was smaller than I imagined, but the way it spilled over a jagged cliff and into a shallow pool gave it an almost eerie beauty. I sat on a nearby rock, my legs trembling from exertion, and took a long drink from my water bottle. The silence was different here. The usual background sounds of the forest had diminished. Even the river far below seemed muted. There was a weight to the air, heavy with dampness and a faint metallic tang that I couldn't place. I felt a small thrill of unease, but I shook it off. It was just the isolation, I told myself, the mind playing tricks when nothing else was around. When I decided to leave, the trouble began. The route I had come down was no longer obvious. Rocks had shifted, fallen trees blocked my path, and the ridge I had seen from above was now obscured by thick brush. I tried to backtrack, but every turn seemed to bring me deeper into dense undergrowth. The forest floor was littered with roots that threatened to trip me with every step, and rocks that were slick from moss and moisture made climbing treacherous. My water was half gone, and my food untouched, but I didn't feel hungry yet. I was focused entirely on finding a recognizable landmark, anything that would orient Maine. Hours passed, and my earlier confidence began to fade into a gnawing anxiety. The sun began to drop behind the canopy. Shadows grew long and stretched across the uneven ground, turning even familiar shapes into threatening figures. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made my heart leap. I tried to mark my path with broken branches and piles of stones, but the dense undergrowth made it hard to see even the markers from a few feet away. The feeling of being watched crept in, not because I saw anyone, but because the forest was alive with subtle movements, branches swaying, leaves shaking, small animals scattering. I had left the main trail hours ago, but now I realized I had no idea where it ran. My map was useless here. GPS on my phone showed a signal, weak and flickering, but it was unreliable, bouncing between locations as though the forest itself interfered. Night fell faster than I expected. Darkness didn't just cover the forest, it swallowed it. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me, and the beam from my flashlight made eerie shadows that twisted across trees and rocks. My legs were cramping, my pack felt like it weighed double, and every sound seemed amplified. Somewhere nearby, something large moved. I didn't see it, but the sound of heavy footsteps, or maybe just a rock rolling, sent my pulse racing. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. Nothing repeated, but the forest didn't feel the same. I had been alone in forests before, but there had always been a path to follow, a trail to cling to. This was different. I had no reference points, no way of knowing whether I was climbing, descending, or moving in circles. I forced myself to keep moving, taking one cautious step after another. I found a shallow creek and decided to follow it, hoping it would lead to a larger waterway and eventually back to the main trail. The creek was rocky and the water cold, running over slippery stones that made my footing precarious. I fell twice, scraping my hands and bruising my knees. Each fall made me more aware of how vulnerable I was. My flashlight was running low, and the thought of being trapped in total darkness gnawed at me. I realized I hadn't eaten anything since morning, and the energy drain was starting to affect my decision-making. Hours passed like this. The forest was unrelenting, an endless maze of trunks, boulders, and fallen trees. My mind began to play cruel tricks, turning ordinary shapes into potential threats, the sound of water into footsteps following me. I felt like I was being watched, but rationally, I knew I was alone. Still, the fear was visceral, gripping my chest, making my hands shake, and sending my heart hammering. I started whispering encouragements to myself, silently, like it would make a difference. My throat was dry, my stomach empty, and my legs screamed with fatigue. Every part of me wanted to sit down and give up, but I couldn't. Giving up here could mean something worse. Tripping in the dark, falling into the creek, or twisting an ankle on rocks where no one would find me for days. Somewhere near midnight, I came across a slope that seemed familiar, a ridge I must have passed during the day. Exhaustion gave me the focus to climb carefully. My hands tore against the rough bark and jagged rocks, my body straining with every step. When I reached the top, the first thing I noticed was a faint, artificial light in the distance. My heart leapt. A road? A campsite? People? I forced myself to move quickly toward it. The slope descended sharply, loose rocks underfoot, but desperation gave me strength I didn't know I had. I stumbled, fell, and scraped my shoulder, but I kept going. Finally, I emerged onto a dirt road, the kind used by rangers and forest maintenance crews. The light came from a vehicle parked nearby. I waved, my legs trembling, my entire body soaked in sweat and dirt. Someone noticed me, and they came over. The relief was overwhelming. I realized I had been lost for more than 12 hours. The man in the truck offered me water and blankets, and I sat on the ground, trembling, exhausted, and almost in tears. I gave him the rough coordinates from my GPS. He told me I was lucky. The terrain I had been hiking was nearly impossible to navigate in the dark, with cliffs and dense undergrowth that could trap someone for days. I spent the night at the ranger station, eating food, wrapping myself in blankets, and trying to calm down. I thought about how close I had come to serious injury, maybe worse. I thought about how easy it would have been to misstep, fall into a ravine, and not be found for days. I thought about the isolation, the forest that seemed benign in daylight but became an unrelenting maze at night. And I realized that the allure of untamed wilderness wasn't worth underestimating its danger. The next day, when I drove back home, every muscle in my body sore and bruised, I couldn't stop thinking about the forest. It hadn't been magical or beautiful in a way that mattered. It had been merciless, and I had barely survived by a combination of luck, persistence, and stubbornness. I made a promise to myself never to take the wild for granted again. Maps, planning, and caution weren't enough. Respect for the sheer unpredictability of nature was what mattered most. And I realized painfully that the forest doesn't care about skill or confidence. It only cares that you always loved hiking, the feeling of being alone in the wilderness, the weight of my pack, the crunch of dry leaves under my boots, the way the forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. There was a certain satisfaction in relying on yourself, in knowing that no one could help you if you made a mistake, and that every step had to be deliberate, careful, and measured. I had done long hikes before, some for days at a time, and I considered myself fairly experienced. I liked challenging trails, isolated paths, and places where the trail disappeared into the raw, untamed land. It was during one of those hikes that I found myself in a situation I had never imagined, where fear didn't come from the dark or the unknown, but from something far more real and immediate. The hike began early in the morning. I had planned it meticulously, checked the weather, studied the topography, and packed all the essentials. I left my car at a small trailhead, far from the main roads, where the gravel was scattered and the trees pressed close to the edges of the parking area. The sky was still pale with the first hints of sunlight when I stepped onto the trail. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine needles, a smell I had come to associate with peace. I started at a brisk pace, the rhythm of my boots striking the ground, the straps of my pack snug against my shoulders, the small knife on my belt a comforting presence. The trail was steep at first, winding through thick undergrowth and clusters of young trees. I passed a small creek that gurgled and twisted among rocks and roots, the water cold and clear. I paused to drink and refill my bottle, crouching on the smooth stones and watching the light shift on the ripples. The solitude was complete. No other hikers, no distant cars, no birds in sight. Only the wind and the crunching of leaves under my feet. I liked this part of hiking, the absolute isolation. It made me feel alive. As I ascended, the trail became less distinct. There were markings, but they were faint, small paint blazes on trees that had started to fade, some partially hidden under moss or lichen. I kept an eye out, knowing I would need them. The terrain was rugged, with steep slopes and loose rocks underfoot. The forest thickened, the trees older and more twisted, roots snaking across the path like natural obstacles designed to trip you. I used my trekking poles to steady myself, and I took my time, careful with each step. At one point, the trail disappeared completely, leaving only a faint impression in the soil. I stopped, looked around, and tried to retrace my steps, but the terrain had shifted subtly with fallen branches and debris. I decided to follow what seemed like the trail, even though it was becoming a gamble. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, but the canopy of dense trees left the forest floor in shadow. I drank water, ate some trail mix, and checked my watch. I still had plenty of daylight to reach my planned camping spot, a small clearing near the top of a ridge that overlooked a valley. The clearing was supposed to have a spring nearby, but I had to be cautious. I knew the map, but maps in areas like this were often imprecise, and the terrain changed faster than any printed lines could show. At some point, I noticed a strange sensation, the kind that creeps up gradually. The forest seemed quieter than before, almost unnaturally so. Birds were absent, and even the wind felt dampened, as if the thick trees were swallowing sound. I paused and listened, trying to shake off the unease. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just tired, that the trail being rough and the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I continued, but the path became almost non-existent. The forest floor was uneven, covered in decaying leaves, fallen branches, and moss. My boots sank slightly into wet soil in places, and my poles slipped on slick roots. I had to navigate around trees, scramble over fallen logs, and find footholds on the rocky slope. My energy started to ebb, and I began to feel the strain in my legs and shoulders. I drank more water and tried to keep my mind on the rhythm of moving forward rather than the creeping sense of being watched. By mid-afternoon, the sun was lower, and the shadows grew long. I finally reached a point that looked like it could be the ridge, a slightly flattened area among tall pines. But the clearing I expected wasn't there. There was no open space, no spring, nothing but thick undergrowth and uneven ground. I realized I must have missed a turn, or perhaps the trail I was following was no longer maintained and had faded entirely. I checked my compass and tried to orient myself. The ridge ran roughly east-west, and I needed to move north to follow the plan. but the terrain was steep, and the ground below fell sharply into a shadowed valley. I made the decision to climb higher, hoping that reaching the top would give me a better view. I pushed through thick underbrush, pulling myself over roots and rocks, feeling my heart race as the slope steepened. My pack felt heavier with every step, sweat running down my face despite the cool air. I finally reached a small plateau, not the one I intended, but a spot where I could catch my breath. The forest stretched endlessly around me, and I could just make out the valley below, dark and shadowed. It was then that I noticed something strange. On the slope across from me, there were disturbances in the undergrowth, subtle at first but unmistakable. Branches bent and snapped, leaves shifted, and there was a low, irregular movement that didn't seem natural. My stomach tightened. I froze, scanning the area, trying to determine what it was. There were no birds, no other animals, just that movement, irregular and deliberate. I thought maybe it was a deer or some forest creature, but it didn't move like any animal I had seen. I waited, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the slope. Then I saw it clearly. A figure, or something that looked human, was moving slowly, deliberately across the trees. At first, I thought it might be another hiker, but the movements were wrong, too stiff, too cautious, almost stalking in nature. I ducked behind a tree, heart hammering, trying to convince myself I was seeing things. But the figure kept moving, maintaining a distance, never crossing the slope fully into the clearing, but always visible in glimpses. Panic set in. My first thought was to leave, to descend and try to get back to the trail, but the slope below was treacherous and I had no clear path. I considered climbing higher to reach a more open area, but the ridge continued, and I wasn't sure if it would lead to safety or just deeper into the forest. I needed to think. My hands shook as I adjusted my pack, gripping my trekking poles, ready to move quickly. The figure paused, as if sensing me. I froze. It was hard to see clearly, but it was wearing dark clothing and seemed to have some kind of pack. The stance was deliberate, and it started moving toward me slowly, carefully. I realized then that it was following the same path I had taken, perhaps watching, perhaps tracking. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but running on that terrain could be fatal. I had to move strategically. I backed away slowly, keeping trees between us, trying to find a slope that led safely downward. My mind raced through options. I thought about screaming, making noise, but that would only reveal my location. I remembered the whistle in my pack and considered using it to attract help, but with no one around, it might only provoke the person following me. I had to descend quietly, carefully, and put distance between us. I began to navigate down the slope, sliding over loose soil and stepping carefully on exposed roots. Every snap of a branch underfoot made me flinch. The figure mirrored my movements at a distance, never closing too fast but always present. My heart was in my throat, and my breath came in short, sharp bursts. Hours seemed to stretch into minutes, each movement deliberate. My senses heightened to every sound, every shadow, every shift in the forest. Eventually, the slope leveled into a smaller valley, the terrain more forgiving. I picked up the pace, though still careful, and kept the figure out of direct sight. I was exhausted, legs burning, but adrenaline kept me moving. I looked for a path, a creek, anything that could lead me back to a main trail. Then I saw it, a faint trail, partially overgrown but recognizable. I moved toward it, heart racing, glancing back. The figure had stopped on the higher slope, watching me, then slowly retreated, disappearing into the forest. I didn't wait to see more. Once on the trail, I moved faster, using the last of my energy to descend toward a known junction. The forest was alive again with normal sounds. Birds, the wind, the rustling of leaves. Relief washed over me, but I remained alert, scanning the trees. I reached a small creek, the sound of water soothing, and followed it downhill, hoping it would lead me to a larger trail or road. Hours later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I finally emerged onto a wider, maintained trail. My legs were trembling, my pack heavy, and I was covered in sweat, dirt, and scratches from the underbrush. I could see the faint glow of headlights on a distant road and moved toward it, breaking into a run despite exhaustion. When I reached my car, I collapsed. I had been planning this hike for months, carefully studying maps, checking trails, and watching the weather reports. The forest I chose wasn't famous, not a tourist hotspot, just a sprawling stretch of national park that few people ventured into. The solitude was part of the appeal. I wanted to escape the noise, the constant movement of the city, the faces and voices that never stopped. I needed silence, and I thought the forest could give it to me. I started early in the morning before the sun fully rose. The air was cold, crisp, and smelled faintly of pine and wet earth. I had packed lightly: a backpack with water, a small first aid kit, some energy bars, a flashlight, a spare battery, and a compact map. My hiking boots were worn in but sturdy, and I wore layers: a thin t-shirt, a fleece jacket, and a waterproof shell. I had my phone, of course, though I knew signal would fade once I got deeper. I didn't care. I wanted to be cut off. The trail began gently, a narrow dirt path winding between thick stands of pine. Sunlight filtered through the branches, dust motes floating in the shafts of light. Birds chirped in the trees, and I could hear the occasional rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. I moved steadily, my breathing slow and even, enjoying the rhythm of walking. After about an hour, the trail became steeper, climbing a ridge that overlooked a narrow valley. The ground underfoot shifted from compact dirt to loose stones, making each step require more attention. I paused at a clearing to drink some water. Looking down into the valley, I could see the fog rolling along the river below, curling around the tree trunks like smoke. The higher I climbed, the quieter it became. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, nothing but wind through the trees and the occasional creak of a branch. I felt an odd sense of both calm and unease. There was freedom in the isolation, but also a creeping awareness that I was completely alone. After another hour, the trail started to split. I paused, checking my map carefully. One path followed the ridge, narrow and steep, with sheer drops on one side. The other dropped into a small canyon, winding along the edge of the stream below. Both trails looked challenging. I chose the ridge, thinking the view would be worth it. The path was barely wide enough for 1 foot at a time in places, and loose stones slid under my boots. I had to move slowly, deliberately. Every step required my full attention. By mid-morning, the trail had become almost unnavigable. Trees leaned across the path, fallen branches littered the ground, and some sections had eroded completely, leaving small cliffs of dirt and stone. I had to scramble over rocks, reach up to grab branches, and occasionally lower myself carefully down steep slopes. My heart rate increased, not from exertion, but from the sense of exposure. One misstep could send me tumbling down the side of the ridge, and there was no one to help me. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning on my knees and looking around. The forest here was ancient, dense, and the canopy thick enough that sunlight barely reached the ground. Everything was shades of green and brown. Moss clung to rocks, and roots twisted across the path like natural traps. I tried to calm my rising panic, telling myself that I was experienced, that I had done difficult hikes before. But this felt different. There was an intensity here, a sharpness to the isolation that gnawed at me. I pressed on, moving slowly, aware of every loose stone and branch underfoot. The trail curved sharply, and I thought I heard something. A soft crack, like a branch breaking far below. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. Nothing. Maybe a deer. Maybe nothing at all. I told myself to focus. I had a long hike ahead, and fear could be my undoing if I let it take over. Around noon, I reached a section of the ridge that was almost vertical on one side. The path narrowed to less than a foot in places, with a sheer drop to my left. I had to cling to the rock wall with one hand while feeling for secure footing with my boots. The wind picked up, cold and biting, making me shiver through my layers. I inched along, counting steps, measuring each one. Took every ounce of concentration. Halfway across, I heard the sound again. A soft, deliberate snap, as if someone or something had stepped on a branch above. My breath caught. I froze. The sound didn't repeat, but the hairs on my neck stood on end. I scanned the trees, but there was no one, no movement. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it be another hiker? The trail was almost deserted. I hadn't seen a single person all morning. Could it be an animal? Bears lived in these forests, but I hadn't seen any signs. Still, the possibility made my stomach tighten. I moved faster now, though cautiously, trying to reach a wider section of trail. My muscles ached from the tension. My fingers scraped from gripping rough bark and stone. Sweat ran down my back, though the air was cold. My heart thumped in my chest, a constant drumbeat that matched the fear building in my mind. Finally, the trail opened up into a plateau. The ground here was more stable, flat, and covered with pine needles. I sank onto a fallen log, my legs trembling. I drank water and ate an energy bar, trying to calm my pulse. I told myself that the ridge section was behind me, and that once I followed the plateau, the trail would descend gently into the valley below. But even as I rested, a sense of unease lingered. Something about the ridge, about the sound of breaking branches, made me feel watched, exposed, vulnerable. I decided to follow the plateau toward the valley. The trail descended gradually, winding through thick underbrush and dense trees. The light dimmed as the canopy thickened, and I had to step carefully over roots and rocks hidden in shadow. My energy was draining faster than I expected. Every step required effort, not just physically but mentally, to maintain balance and focus. Mid-afternoon, I heard the sound again, this time closer, a crunch of leaves behind me. I froze, my body stiff. I turned slowly, scanning the forest. Nothing moved. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. A lost hiker, a stalker, a wild animal. I clenched my fists and tried to calm my breathing. Every instinct told me to move fast, to get to safety, but the trail was narrow, and running could make me fall. I decided to continue cautiously, stepping lightly, making deliberate movements. The crunching sound followed me, intermittent, sometimes far, sometimes near. It wasn't constant, but it was close enough to make my skin crawl. I considered calling for help on my phone, but I remembered the spotty reception. Better to keep moving than rely on a signal that might not exist. As the afternoon wore on, the trail grew darker. The sun dipped behind the ridge, shadows stretching across the forest floor. I realized I might not make it back before nightfall. My backpack felt heavier with each step, my legs burning from constant exertion. Every snapping branch, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. My mind oscillated between determination to finish the hike and the fear that I wasn't alone. I reached a small creek just as the last light faded. The water ran clear and cold, and I knelt to drink and splash my face. The sound of water was calming, a small reprieve from the constant tension. But as I stood, I noticed something. Footprints in the soft mud near the bank. Not my own. They were large, and the spacing suggested a heavier person, someone who had passed recently. My stomach tightened. The crunching sound, the feeling of being followed, the prints, it all connected. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was here, somewhere close. Panic threatened to overtake me, but I forced myself to think. I couldn't outrun someone without knowing where they were. I couldn't hide easily in the open forest. I needed a plan. I remembered a ridge just across the creek that led to a service road shown on my map. It would be a difficult climb, but it could lead me to safety. I had no choice. I waded through the creek, boots heavy with water, and started the climb. The slope was steep, slick with mud and moss. My hands scraped on rocks. My feet slipped. I cursed under my breath, forcing one step at a time, my heart hammering with exertion and fear. Behind me, the rustling continued, closer now. I didn't dare look. My focus was on the climb, on staying upright, on reaching the top. After what felt like hours, though it was probably only 30 minutes, I reached the top. The slope leveled out, and in the distance, I could just make out the service road through a break in the trees. Relief surged through me, sharp and physical. I didn't stop to rest. I ran as fast as I could over the uneven ground, my legs screaming, the pack heavy on my back. The crunching noises behind me stopped, but I didn't care. I had to keep moving. Finally, I reached the service road. The ground was flat and solid. I could see tire tracks, signs of human activity. I ran along it until I saw a small maintenance shed. And beyond that, the I had been planning this hike for months, checking weather forecasts, studying maps, and making lists of everything I would need. I wanted to push myself further than I ever had before, to take a trail that was considered difficult even for experienced hikers. The path was deep in the mountains, far from roads and towns, and I knew that if anything went wrong, help would be hours or even a full day away. I didn't tell anyone exactly when I was leaving or the trail I planned to take, not out of secrecy, but out of habit. I had always hiked alone, and I liked it that way. The freedom felt raw and personal. I started early in the morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in faint oranges and purples. The air was crisp and cool, smelling of damp earth and pine needles. I carried a full backpack, a tent, a sleeping bag, extra clothing, food for 3 days, a first aid kit, and water. I also carried a small hand crank radio and a flashlight, although I doubted I would need them if everything went according to plan. The trail was steep from the beginning, cutting through thick underbrush and clusters of trees so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. Every step required concentration. The soil was loose in places, and jagged roots twisted underfoot like hidden traps. I moved slowly, deliberately, resting every few hundred meters to catch my breath and take in the views. The mountains stretched endlessly around me, ridges layered upon ridges fading into the morning mist. There was a strange beauty in how silent it was. No birds sang nearby, no insects buzzed. It was almost as if the forest was holding its breath, watching me as much as I watched it. By midday, I had reached a narrow ridge where the trail skirted a steep drop. The wind blew fiercely there, whipping against my jacket and tugging at my backpack. I paused, gripping the rocks along the edge to steady myself. Looking down, I could see the valley floor far below, rivers carving silver paths through the dense forest. I took a deep breath and forced my legs forward, each step deliberate. The trail twisted and narrowed as I climbed higher. Loose rocks made the footing precarious. I felt a growing sense of isolation that I couldn't shake. Even though I had been hiking alone for years, there was something different about this trail. It felt untouched, almost untouched by humans in a way that was both exhilarating and slightly terrifying. I reached a plateau in the late afternoon. It was small, just enough space for my tent, but it had a view over a small creek far below. I decided to camp there for the night. Setting up the tent took longer than expected because the ground was uneven, dotted with rocks and hardened roots. I finally managed, securing all the stakes as tightly as I could. The sun was dipping behind the peaks by the time I finished, and a cold wind had begun to sweep through the ridge. I built a small fire, careful to clear all the dry leaves around it, and ate a simple meal of canned beans and bread. The fire's glow was comforting against the encroaching dark, but it did little to erase the gnawing feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. I kept my flashlight close and listened to the forest around me. Every crackle of a twig or distant rustle made me flinch. I tried to rationalize it. Animals, the wind, but there was something in the way the sounds carried, sharp and deliberate, that unsettled me. The night passed slowly. I lay in my sleeping bag, flashlight within reach, staring at the ceiling of my tent as the wind howled outside. Around midnight, a loud crash echoed through the trees. My heart jumped. It sounded heavy, like a large branch snapping under the weight of something. I froze, listening. Then there was another noise, a dragging sound, slow and deliberate, moving across rocks and fallen branches. I clutched my flashlight and pressed myself as low as I could. I told myself it was a deer or some other large animal, but my instinct screamed that it wasn't. I didn't sleep much after that. Every noise, every movement in the trees made me tense. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to remember my training, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. By dawn, I was exhausted and jittery, but I knew I had to continue. The next day, I planned to follow the trail down into the valley where the creek ran. My legs were sore from the climb, and my backpack felt heavier than usual. I moved carefully, testing each step on the loose rocks and uneven soil. About 2 hours into the descent, I noticed something strange. The trail ahead was partially blocked by a fallen tree, but the ground beneath it looked disturbed, as if someone or something had been there recently. Footprints? I couldn't tell for sure. They were irregular, not human, but too large and deliberate to belong to a deer. A cold knot of fear formed in my stomach. I considered turning back, but I was already committed to the trail. I continued cautiously, eyes scanning every shadow, ears straining for any sound. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from behind me. I froze, heart hammering, and waited. The wind carried it again, this time closer, punctuated by the snap of a branch. I didn't run. I didn't want to provoke whatever it was. Instead, I slowly shifted to the side, trying to keep my movements smooth and quiet. I kept my flashlight out, shining it toward the area behind me in quick bursts. The growl didn't repeat, but the sense of being followed persisted. Every few steps, I glanced back. Shadows moved just beyond the tree line. I told myself it was a mountain lion or maybe a bear, and both were dangerous, but I had read survival guides and I knew staying calm was crucial. Hours passed like this. Every rustle, every snap, every bird startled me more than the last. I drank water and ate small bites of food, trying to keep my energy up. As I neared the creek, the trail became even more treacherous. Rocks slick with moss lined the edges, and water from recent rains had carved small streams across the path. My focus narrowed to every step. One slip and I could easily fall, or worse, be injured somewhere the wind couldn't reach me. Around late afternoon, I reached the creek. It was shallow but fast-moving, tumbling over rocks and creating small waterfalls. I followed it upstream, hoping to find a safer place to camp. The forest here was dense, and the sound of running water masked many of the noises that had been following me. For a few hours, I felt a fleeting sense of relief. Then I saw the footprints again. They were fresh, leading along the creek toward where I had been heading. My stomach turned. They were definitely human. The prints were irregular, as if the person who made them had been moving quickly or unsteadily. Whoever it was, they had been here very recently, maybe even minutes ago. Panic began to creep in, but I forced myself to think. I didn't have a phone signal and there was no one else around. If I ran, I could slip, fall, or get lost. If I stayed, I could be spotted. I decided to follow the creek a little further, hoping to reach a safer area where I could observe and decide. The terrain worsened. Steep banks, tangled roots, and wet rocks. My muscles screamed in protest. My hands cut and scraped from gripping rocks and branches. Night approached again earlier than I realized. I needed shelter, so I found a small overhang along the creek. It wasn't ideal, but it provided some cover. I huddled under it, exhausted, and ate the last of my food. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified. I wrapped my jacket around myself tightly, flashlight at the ready, and waited for sunrise. When morning came, I could see more clearly. The footprints were gone, but the sense of being followed remained. I considered leaving immediately, but the creek's edge was slippery and steep. I needed a safer path. I remembered a side trail marked on my map that led up to a ridge I had passed the day before. It was a longer route, but it might lead me back to a point where I could safely descend. I moved slowly, testing every step, using a stick to check the stability of the ground. The climb was grueling. I slipped multiple times, bruising my legs and arms. I had to rest frequently, sitting on rocks or clinging to trees for support. My mind replayed every noise from the previous night. I imagined being trapped, injured, and completely isolated. But I forced myself to focus on the trail one step at a time. By midday, I had reached the ridge. Relief washed over me as I saw a distant dirt road winding through the trees below. It was faint, but unmistakable. I had made it to a point where I could potentially get help. I carefully descended the ridge, moving cautiously but with renewed determination. The road grew closer, and I started shouting intermittently, hoping someone might hear me. Eventually, I reached the edge of the forest and stumbled onto the dirt road. Within an hour, a truck came by, driven by a local hiker who had seen my signal. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and covered in scratches and bruises, but I was safe. The drive back to the nearest town felt surreal. The world outside the forest seemed almost unreal. I had always considered myself an experienced hiker. I had spent years navigating trails, camping in the wilderness, and pushing my body to the limit on long treks. So when I decided to go on a solo hiking trip in the remote mountains far from any towns or main roads, I thought I was prepared for anything. The trail I chose was known for its rugged terrain and sparse visitors. Most hikers only attempted it during the peak season, but I was determined to go in early spring, before the snow had fully melted, when the air was crisp and the forest was quiet. I started my hike early in the morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise. The sky was a soft gray with streaks of orange, and the forest smelled damp and earthy. The trailhead was almost unmarked, just a small sign barely visible from the road, and I had parked my car in a tiny clearing nearby. The path started off gently, winding through towering pines and thick underbrush. I had studied the map thoroughly, memorized the landmarks, and double-checked my gear the night before. Backpack, water, high-calorie snacks, first aid kit, a sturdy knife, compass, flashlight, and extra batteries. I even carried a small rope in case I needed it. I had prepared for emergencies, or so I thought. The first few hours were uneventful. I walked at a steady pace, the crunch of pine needles and twigs under my boots the only sound. Birds called occasionally, but mostly it was the quiet of the forest. The trail was narrow and twisted, sometimes barely visible beneath patches of melting snow. Every so often, I had to cross small streams, careful not to slip on wet rocks. The air was cold, and I made sure to keep moving to stay warm. I had brought a jacket, gloves, and a hat, all of which I used. Around midday, I reached a small clearing with a view of the mountains in the distance. I stopped to rest, eat a snack, and take a sip of water. That's when I noticed something unusual. Footprints in the mud, partially covered by snow. They were human, large, and fresh, maybe only a few hours old. My first thought was relief. I wasn't entirely alone, and if I got into trouble, maybe someone else was nearby. But as I examined them more closely, I realized they didn't look like regular hiking boots. The prints were oddly deep, as if someone very heavy had walked through the soft ground, and the stride was uneven. It made my stomach tighten. I looked around the clearing, scanning the edges of the forest. Nothing moved. No birds, no animals. Not a single sound except the wind whispering through the trees. I tried to shake off the unease and continued on the trail. The terrain grew steeper as I ascended. Snow patches became larger, and some areas had ice that made footing treacherous. I used my trekking poles and rope in a few spots to steady myself and prevent slipping. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest floor. That's when I noticed something else. Broken branches along the trail, as if someone had pushed through the trees roughly. At first, I thought it could be animals, maybe deer, but the pattern didn't make sense. The breaks were at a human height, and the force seemed deliberate. My pace quickened, partly out of fatigue, partly out of growing anxiety. As darkness approached, I realized I was running out of daylight faster than I had anticipated. My map indicated a small ridge that I could use as a temporary campsite, but it was still a few miles away. The trail became less defined, almost disappearing in some areas under snow and fallen branches. I was concentrating so hard on my footing that I didn't notice the distant sound at first. Snapping twigs, faint at first, then growing slightly louder, consistent like footsteps. I froze. The sound didn't match mine. It wasn't my echo. It was deliberate enough to suggest someone was following me. My pulse quickened, and I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was another hiker who had camped nearby, maybe someone else on the trail. I paused and listened carefully. The sound stopped when I stopped, and when I moved again, it resumed. I started walking faster, trying to get to the ridge before nightfall. Night fell faster than I expected, and I had to use my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating jagged rocks and twisted roots. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. My mind raced, thinking of all the worst-case scenarios. I had heard stories of hikers getting lost and attacked in remote areas, but I had always dismissed them as sensationalized. Now, alone, in the dark, the reality felt closer than ever. I finally reached the ridge, a narrow stretch of flat ground surrounded by steep slopes. I set up my tent quickly, trying not to make noise. Every sound I made, the rustling of fabric, the hammering of stakes, felt amplified in the still night. I made a small fire, enough to keep me warm and provide some light. The warmth of the flames helped calm me slightly, but the feeling of being watched never left. I lay in my sleeping bag, flashlight nearby, listening intently. Hours passed. The forest was alive with nocturnal sounds. Owl calls, the rustle of small animals. But the footsteps never came close enough for me to confirm if anyone was near. Occasionally, I thought I heard movement just outside the tent, subtle enough to make my heart race. I didn't sleep much that night, barely dozing, too alert to close my eyes fully. Morning came, pale and gray. I packed up quickly, eager to leave the ridge. The sun barely penetrated the thick forest canopy, and the trail seemed even more treacherous in daylight. I descended slowly, careful of ice and loose rocks. That's when I realized something alarming. My water bottle, which I had kept full the night before, was nearly empty. I hadn't drunk enough the day before, and the thought of being dehydrated added urgency to my hike. By midday, I noticed more signs. Branches bent, footprints again, deeper and closer than before. I kept moving but avoided the larger areas of snow, which would leave obvious tracks. The anxiety was gnawing at me, but I forced myself to stay rational. I reminded myself I had gear, food, water, and a map. I just needed to keep going. Late afternoon, I reached a point where the trail forked. My map indicated the left fork led down to a road I could reach by evening, while the right fork went deeper into the mountains. I chose the left, but almost immediately the trail became a maze of fallen trees and thick underbrush. My pace slowed, and I had to scramble over rocks and crawl under branches. The sun was beginning to dip, and I realized I might have miscalculated my path. The fear of night falling again in unfamiliar terrain made my chest tighten. Then I heard it. The footsteps again, closer now, crunching over dead leaves and small rocks. I stopped, frozen, straining my ears. They weren't constant, but intermittent, always following the same rhythm, as if someone was waiting for the right moment to close in. I started walking faster, trying not to run, knowing a fall on the rocky slope could be fatal. The noise followed. In desperation, I remembered a trick I had read about in survival guides: changing direction and using natural obstacles. I veered off the trail slightly, moving along a narrow ridge with steep drops to either side, hoping the terrain would slow anyone following me. I kept low, crawling in some places, and finally stumbled upon a small, shallow cave in the cliffside. It wasn't more than a few feet deep, but it offered concealment. I crawled inside, pressed myself against the wall, and stayed silent. Time passed slowly. I could hear distant sounds outside, branches breaking, leaves rustling. But eventually, the footsteps stopped. I didn't dare move for what felt like hours. The light outside faded, leaving only the faint glow of the moon through the trees. Eventually, the forest returned to normal nighttime sounds, and I assumed whoever or whatever was following me had moved on. I waited until full darkness, then carefully started descending again. I kept to the ridge, moving as silently as possible, until the trail finally opened onto a small dirt road. Relief flooded me. I had no cell service, but I could see tire tracks and signs of human activity. I walked along the road until I reached a small parking area, where a lone car was parked. Exhausted, dehydrated, and shaken, I realized I had survived something I couldn't fully explain. The trail that had seemed so serene in daylight had turned into a test of endurance and instinct. Eventually, I found a ranger station a few miles down the road. I explained my situation, though I didn't mention the footprints or the feeling of being followed. They would have thought I was imagining things. They confirmed the trail was remote, and few hikers attempted it alone, especially this early in the season. I rested, drank water, and allowed myself to process what had happened. It took me weeks to shake the sense of unease completely. Even now, months later, I avoid that section of the mountains. The experience taught me that nature can be unpredictable, and that danger doesn't always come from animals or weather. Sometimes it comes from the unknown presence of another human. I survived that. I had always considered myself experienced when it came to hiking. I wasn't one of those people who went out for a leisurely walk and called it an adventure. I had done multi-day hikes, rough terrain, unpredictable weather. I had done it all, or so I thought. That confidence, that overestimation of my own abilities, is what put me in the situation I ended up in. It started as a simple plan. A solo hike in a section of the forest that was remote but technically accessible. A trail that wasn't well marked but was known among serious hikers. It promised isolation, the kind of solitude that made people think they were one with nature. I thought I could handle it. I thought I knew what I was getting into. I started early in the morning, when the sky was still a pale gray, and the first light was filtering through the dense canopy of trees. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. There was the usual rustle of leaves underfoot, the occasional bird call, but other than that, the silence was heavy, oppressive. I felt good, though. I was carrying enough water, food, and gear to last 2 days, and I had made sure my phone was fully charged. I had a compass, a map, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a small first aid kit. I checked everything twice before starting, walking in a brisk rhythm, feeling the familiar satisfaction of being alone in the wild. The trail began as a dirt path, clear enough to follow easily. Fallen leaves covered the ground in shades of brown and gold. The air was crisp, smelling faintly of pine and damp soil. I moved steadily, noting the small details of the forest, the way the morning light caught on wet leaves, the shadows of branches creating patterns on the ground, the occasional squirrel darting up a tree. It was peaceful, almost mesmerizing, the kind of peace that made you forget everything else in the world. After about 2 hours of hiking, the trail began to narrow. The trees grew closer together, and the undergrowth became thicker. I had to duck under low branches and step over roots that jutted out from the ground. The sounds of the forest seemed to amplify. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a leaf echoing strangely in the stillness. I passed a small creek, its water running clear over smooth stones. I paused for a moment to drink, crouching down and filling my bottle, listening to the sound of water. It was refreshing, and I felt invigorated, ready for whatever came next. As the morning turned into afternoon, the path became less obvious. The trail markers were few and far between, faded and hard to see. I relied heavily on my map and compass, double-checking my bearings at every turn. The terrain became steeper, with loose rocks and patches of mud making each step a careful calculation. The sun was higher now, filtering through the treetops in streaks of light, and the heat was starting to build. I was sweating, my shirt sticking to my back, but I didn't mind. I liked the physical challenge. It was around midday when I noticed something strange. The forest, which had been quiet in a pleasant way, now felt almost too quiet. There were no birds, no insects, no movement at all except for the occasional leaf drifting to the ground. The wind had died down, leaving the air heavy and still. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just a part of the forest, that sometimes nature goes silent. I pressed on, keeping my pace steady, but I started paying closer attention to every sound, every shadow. By mid-afternoon, I realized I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. The trail I was on no longer matched the map exactly. The landmarks I had been using didn't line up, and the small creek I expected to cross had disappeared. I double-checked my compass. My heading was correct, but the terrain around me didn't make sense. Trees were denser here, and the ground was uneven, covered in thick roots and rocks. I began to feel the first stirrings of unease. I wasn't lost yet, not completely, but I could feel the margin for error shrinking. Every step had to be deliberate. I stopped to rest, sitting on a fallen log and taking out my water bottle. I tried to think logically. If I retraced my steps, I might find the correct path again. But retracing was risky. The undergrowth was dense, and I could lose the trail entirely. I weighed my options. I could continue forward using my compass and map as best I could, or I could backtrack carefully. I decided to move forward, trusting my instincts and the compass, but I kept a mental note to be ready to turn back if the terrain became too dangerous. The afternoon passed slowly. I moved cautiously, my eyes scanning constantly for any sign of a path. The forest was oppressive now, the canopy blocking most of the sunlight. Shadows lengthened, and the air cooled, carrying a faint dampness that clung to my skin. Every sound seemed magnified. The snap of a branch underfoot, the distant call of a bird, the rustle of leaves that might have been caused by the wind or something else. I tried not to think about what that something else could be. Around late afternoon, I found a small clearing. It was barely more than a break in the trees, maybe 20 feet across, but it gave me a sense of relief. I could see the sky above, the last golden light filtering through the branches. I decided to stop here for a longer break, to rest and eat something. I pulled out my granola bar and water, sitting on a rock at the edge of the clearing. The forest around me was quiet again, too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I laughed at myself for thinking that. I was alone, no one else was here, and the only creatures in the forest were small animals. Still, the feeling persisted. I finished my snack quickly and packed everything back into my backpack. I had to keep moving. I resumed hiking, and that's when the real difficulty began. The trail completely disappeared in places, replaced by a chaotic jumble of roots, rocks, and fallen trees. I had to climb over logs and squeeze through thickets, every step taking more effort than the last. My legs ached, my shoulders burned from carrying the pack, but I kept pushing forward. The light was fading fast, and I knew I had to find a suitable spot to set up camp before nightfall. As the sun dipped lower, I realized I was running out of time. The forest was a maze now, every tree looking the same, every path indistinguishable from the next. I slowed down, scanning the ground for any flat area that could serve as a campsite. I found a small patch of relatively level ground near a large rock formation and decided to settle there. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best I could do. I dropped my pack, pulled out my tent, and began the process of setting it up. My hands were shaking slightly, whether from exhaustion or anxiety, I wasn't sure. By the time the tent was set up, the last light had vanished, leaving me in near total darkness. I used my flashlight to illuminate the area, placing it on a rock so I could continue unpacking and preparing. I had water, food, and a small stove, but the forest felt entirely different at night. Every sound was amplified, the rustling of leaves, the creak of branches, the distant call of an animal. I tried to focus on the practical tasks, cooking a simple meal, checking my gear, making sure the tent was secure. My mind refused to stop racing, though, constantly replaying the moments when I had been unsure of the trail, when I had felt that oppressive silence. That night, sleep was elusive. Every noise startled me. A branch snapping nearby made me jump, heart pounding. I told myself it was probably a deer or some small animal, but the fear persisted. I stayed awake for hours, listening to the forest, my flashlight off to conserve battery, my hands resting on my backpack in case I needed to move quickly. The air was cold, and I shivered under my sleeping bag, trying to will myself to rest. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep, full of restless dreams filled with shadows and strange movements. I woke early, before dawn, to the sound of something moving outside the tent. My heart raced. I listened carefully. There were small noises, footsteps, something brushing against leaves. I couldn't see through the thick fabric of the tent, but I remained still, holding my breath. After a few minutes, the noises faded, leaving only the natural sounds of the forest awakening. I convinced myself it had been an animal, nothing more, and forced myself to get up. I packed quickly, my anxiety pushing me to move faster than I probably should have. The morning was thick with fog, reducing visibility to just a few feet. I tried to follow the compass and map again, but everything looked the same. Trees loomed out of the fog like silent sentinels, roots and rocks hidden beneath the mist making every step precarious. I slipped once on wet mud, catching myself just in time on a tree trunk. My muscles ached. My mind was fraying, but I kept going. I had to find the main trail, or I could be trapped in this maze of forest indefinitely. Hours passed. The fog lifted slightly, revealing more of the terrain, but it also revealed the extent of my disorientation. I realized I had walked in a large circle over. I had been planning this hike for months, obsessively checking maps, reading trail reports, and watching videos from people who had tackled the same area. It was a remote trail in the mountains that few people ever visited, which appealed to me because I wanted solitude, a chance to disconnect, and a real challenge. The thought of rugged terrain, sharp ridges, dense forests, and sheer cliffs made me nervous, but I was confident in my preparation. I had the proper gear: a sturdy backpack, waterproof boots, warm clothing layered for the unpredictable mountain weather, a first aid kit, a reliable compass, a GPS device, enough food for several days, and a couple of liters of water. I told no one exactly where I was going beyond a vague reference to the range and left early in the morning when the sun was barely breaking the horizon, casting a soft orange glow over the valley below. The first hours were straightforward. The trailhead was quiet, surrounded by towering pine and spruce trees that filtered the sunlight into green-gold shafts. The air was sharp, clean, and carried the faint smell of wet earth and pine needles. I moved at a steady pace, savoring the rhythm of walking, the quiet punctuated only by birds and the occasional distant rustle of an unseen animal. The path was narrow, with roots weaving across it like natural tripwires, and the occasional fallen branch that forced me to step carefully. I had started with a light pack to keep my balance on tricky sections, but even so, I was aware of how quickly the energy drained from the body when hiking uphill with weight. I made sure to drink water at regular intervals and to eat small snacks, nuts and dried fruit to keep my stamina up. By mid-morning, the trail began to incline sharply, the forest thinning to make way for jagged rock faces. The scent of pine faded, replaced by the harsher, metallic smell of mineral-laden soil. Small streams trickled down from higher elevations, their water clear and cold, tumbling over mossy stones. I stopped to fill my bottle, enjoying the quiet gurgle of the water. The trail became trickier here, requiring careful navigation over loose gravel and uneven surfaces. Every step had to be deliberate. I reminded myself to breathe steadily, keeping my heart rate manageable, but I couldn't ignore the tight knot of tension in my stomach that had been there since I left the trailhead. By noon, I reached a plateau with a partial view of the valley far below. The wind had picked up, sudden gusts that made the jagged rocks beneath my boots slick with fine dust and sand. I took a break, sitting on a flat boulder, scanning the terrain ahead. The path was barely visible from this vantage point, a thin line snaking along the side of the mountain, shadowed by steep drops. My excitement and sense of adventure were tinged with unease. I was alone, far from help, and the trail, while marked on maps, offered little in the way of safety measures. There were no handrails, no barriers, just sheer rock faces and the constant risk of a misstep. I shook my head and focused on eating, hydrating, and mentally preparing for the next section. The hours after the plateau were slow and tense. The trail narrowed even further, sometimes reduced to a single track carved into the rock. On one side, the mountain rose sharply. On the other, it dropped away into dizzying heights. Every careful step required full attention, and I realized my hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline of navigating these precarious ledges. My boots crunched on loose stones, and every shift of my weight made me hyper-aware of the precariousness beneath my feet. I moved deliberately, testing each foothold before committing my weight, gripping rocks and tree roots for balance. The wind was relentless, rattling loose stones and whipping through the narrow canyon-like sections with an eerie intensity. I knew that if a strong gust caught me at the wrong angle, I could lose my footing in an instant. As the afternoon wore on, clouds began to gather, dark and ominous, curling around the peaks above. The temperature dropped, and a light drizzle began to fall, soaking my clothing and making the rocks slicker. I tightened my pack straps, pulled my waterproof jacket over my layers, and continued, though the climb had become slower, more exhausting. Visibility was decreasing, and I had to rely increasingly on my compass and GPS. The trail twisted unpredictably, sometimes disappearing into dense patches of scrub and small trees clinging to the mountain, forcing me to carefully scan the terrain for safe footing. I felt the first real sense of fear creeping in, the type that wasn't dramatic but insistent, a gnawing awareness of just how exposed I was and how quickly a misstep could escalate into disaster. Then I heard it, the sound of a landslide, or at least the unmistakable rumble of rock shifting far above me. My heart jumped. I froze in place, scanning upward, and saw a small cascade of stones falling along a ridge several meters away. The sound of tumbling rock echoed down the slopes, a sharp, frightening percussion. My pulse surged. I realized that even one miscalculation could bring debris down onto the narrow trail. I retreated slightly, seeking a safer section of rock to steady myself. I waited, listening. After a tense minute, the noise ceased. I continued, now moving slower, more deliberately than ever, aware that the mountain was not passive. It could move against me without warning. By late afternoon, I reached a section where the trail split. One path followed a ledge that hugged the cliffside, exposed and narrow, while the other cut into a shallow gully between jagged outcrops, cluttered with fallen branches and loose stones. I knew from my map that the ledge was more direct, but also far riskier in wet conditions. My shoes were soaked, my energy low, and the drizzle had become steady, chilling through even my waterproof layers. I chose the gully, thinking that some shelter from wind and a slightly wider path would be safer. Immediately, I regretted it. The trail was treacherous, slippery with mud and loose debris, and every step required careful balancing. I slid once, catching myself on a low rock just before my body would have gone tumbling forward. My heart hammered in my chest, sweat and rain mixing on my face. I forced myself to calm down, reminding myself that panicked movements were what caused real accidents. Evening came, dimming the world to a gray wash of rock and mist. I knew I had to find a place to camp soon. The trail became impossible to continue after a point, narrowing into a ridge that disappeared into shadow and fog. There were no flat surfaces suitable for pitching a tent, only jagged rocks, steep drops, and scattered boulders. I descended into a small clearing tucked between two rock faces. It was muddy, uneven, but the only option for the night. I set my backpack down, checked my supplies, and began preparing a makeshift campsite. I cleared some rocks and mud to create a relatively level area for my sleeping pad and bivy sack, securing everything with heavy stones. I ate a small meal of dehydrated food mixed with water, the warm mush a comfort against the cold, damp air. The rain continued, pattering on the rocks and dripping from overhanging branches, chilling my clothes and equipment. Night fell completely, and with it came an oppressive darkness. I could hear the wind funneling through the rock faces, carrying distant echoes of branches snapping, stones clattering down the slopes, and the faint calls of nocturnal animals. I tried to focus on resting, knowing that sleep was essential, but every noise seemed amplified, every shadow suspicious. I lay on my sleeping pad, listening to the mountain around me, imagining worst-case scenarios, visualizing what could happen if I slipped, if a rockfall occurred, if the rain worsened. The fear was rational, grounded in the precariousness of my position, but it was relentless. Around midnight, the wind picked up violently, whipping rain sideways across the clearing. My bivy sack provided some protection, but water seeped in through tiny gaps, soaking my clothes and gear. I hugged my knees to conserve warmth, feeling the cold bite at my fingers and toes. Then came the sound of rocks shifting above me, larger and closer than before. My heart leapt. I crawled as far as I could against the rock face, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and potential falling debris. A small rock tumbled down, striking my backpack with a sharp thud, bouncing and rolling down the slope. I froze, breathing shallowly, waiting for the next one. Several stones followed, clattering down past me in a terrifying, unpredictable rhythm. I realized I couldn't stay here safely for much longer. At first light, I assessed the situation. My campsite was unstable, and the rain had made the trail ahead slippery and dangerous. I had to move. I packed what I could, carefully wrapping wet gear to protect it, and began retracing my path to a more stable section of the trail. The rocks were slick, and my boots slipped once or twice, but I managed to keep my balance by moving slowly, deliberately, and testing each step. The trail seemed longer and steeper than the day before, and I realized how much energy I had expended fighting fear as well as gravity. I had been planning this hike for months. Not a simple day hike or a trail in the park. This was going to be a solo expedition deep into the mountains, somewhere I could be entirely alone, somewhere untouched. I didn't want anyone else there. The idea of solitude was intoxicating, and for weeks I pored over maps, trail reports, and satellite images. Finally, I settled on a stretch of trail that was known for being difficult, unmaintained, and rarely traveled. It promised steep climbs, dense forests, and rugged terrain. It was perfect. I left early in the morning when the sky was still gray with dawn, carrying a large pack loaded with all the essentials: water, food, extra clothes, first aid, navigation tools, and a small sleeping bag in case I couldn't make it back before nightfall. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of wet pine and earth. The trailhead was quiet, deserted. Even the usual sounds of birds seemed muted, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The first few hours were easy. The trail wound upward through thick undergrowth, but the path was still visible. My boots crunched over fallen leaves and loose stones, and I could hear the distant rush of a stream. I passed a few broken markers, barely standing, their paint faded and peeling. I knew from my research that these signs were unreliable, that people often lost the trail here. I stayed vigilant, checking my compass frequently, cross-referencing it with the map. By mid-morning, the trail became steeper. The incline was relentless, and the forest grew thicker, darker. Sunlight barely pierced the canopy. Roots snaked across the path, threatening to trip me at every step. I paused occasionally to drink water and catch my breath, feeling the burn in my legs and lungs. The silence was profound. I realized I hadn't seen anyone since leaving the trailhead, and that was both exhilarating and unnerving. The further I climbed, the more I could feel the weight of isolation pressing down on me. Around noon, I came to a point where the trail split into two unmarked directions. According to my map, the left path should have led me higher into the mountain, following a ridge that promised views I wanted. The right path was less steep, winding through a valley below, but it appeared overgrown and unkempt. I decided to take the left path, confident that I could manage the climb. The trail soon became treacherous. Loose rocks slid under my boots, and I had to use my hands to balance myself along narrow stretches. At one point, I reached a small clearing with jagged rocks protruding from the earth. I paused to catch my breath and drink water, leaning against a boulder that was cool and damp. I noticed small markings on the rocks, scratches that didn't look natural, as if someone or something had carved them. My stomach tightened with unease. It was the first sign that I might not be as alone as I thought. As I continued, the path grew less distinct. Roots and fallen branches blocked my way, and I had to force myself through thickets. My progress slowed, and I began to notice strange sounds. The crack of twigs snapping in the distance, the rustle of leaves where no wind should be. I tried to convince myself it was just wildlife, deer, or perhaps a fox, but the noises were too deliberate, too precise. My heart began to race, but I pressed on, telling myself I was being paranoid. By mid-afternoon, I realized I had been walking for hours without seeing a landmark that matched my map. I stopped and spread the map across a flat rock, tracing my path. My compass read north, and my map indicated I should be nearing a ridge, but all I could see were trees, rocks, and a vague slope. Panic rose in my chest. I was lost. I had prepared for this, carried all the right tools, but nothing matched what I expected. The sun was dropping lower, and shadows stretched long and jagged across the forest floor. I decided to backtrack to the last recognizable marker But as I retraced my steps, I realized the path I had come from seemed subtly different, as if the forest had shifted while I wasn't looking. Rocks that had been on my left were now on my right. A small stream that should have crossed the trail was nowhere to be found. My mind tried to rationalize it, but I couldn't. Every step felt heavier, every sound sharper. The air grew colder, damp, and sharp with the scent of wet stone and decaying leaves. I tried to stay calm, moving carefully, marking the trees with pieces of cloth torn from my shirt so I could track my path. Hours passed. The sky darkened to a muted gray, and the forest was almost pitch black under the thick canopy. My energy was fading, my legs trembling from exhaustion. I realized I hadn't eaten in hours, and my water supply was low. I knew I had to find a safe place to rest, or I might not make it through the night. Eventually, I came across a narrow ledge along the side of the mountain, partially sheltered by overhanging rock. It was small, barely enough to stretch out, but it would protect me from the wind. I unpacked my sleeping bag and settled in, my body shaking from cold and fatigue. I ate a small portion of my food and sipped water slowly. Outside, the forest was alive with strange noises. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, distant animal calls. But none of it felt natural anymore. Something in me told me to be alert, to watch, but I was too drained to argue. I spent a long, restless night on that ledge, listening, imagining shapes in the darkness that weren't really there. I couldn't sleep more than a few minutes at a time, every sound making me flinch. Dawn was a relief, a faint gray light filtering through the canopy, giving me enough visibility to plan my next move. I realized I had no choice but to descend. The ridge I had intended to climb was lost to me, and staying put was not safe. I packed quickly, keeping close to the edge of the ledge to avoid slipping, and began a careful descent. The slope below was steep, covered with loose rocks and thick underbrush. I moved slowly, testing each foothold. My muscles ached from the previous day's climb, but fear sharpened my focus. Every shadow seemed to shift, every rustle made my heart leap. I stumbled once and slid down a few feet, catching myself on a tree trunk. My hands were scratched and bleeding, but I kept going. Hours later, I stumbled upon a small stream. I was relieved. Water was a lifeline, and streams often led to trails or signs of civilization. I followed it downstream, careful to keep my balance on slippery rocks. By late morning, I began to notice faint signs of human activity. Broken branches laid across the forest floor, remnants of an old trail, a plastic bottle partially buried in mud. My hope surged. I was no longer completely lost. Eventually, after hours of careful navigation, I emerged from the dense forest onto a wider, clearer path. It wasn't the trailhead I had started from, but it was unmistakably a trail. Footprints were visible in the mud, recent ones, probably from hikers earlier in the week. I followed the path downhill, and by mid-afternoon, I reached a ranger station at the edge of the forest. Exhausted, filthy, and hungry, I finally had safety. The experience left me shaken. I had been prepared, experienced, and cautious, yet the mountain had thrown me into a disorienting nightmare. I realized how fragile control is in the wilderness, how easily the mind can be overwhelmed by isolation, fatigue, and the unknown. I had survived, but the memory of that dark forest, the twisting, unmarked paths, and the suffocating solitude would stay with me forever. After a long shower, warm food, and a place to rest, I recounted the experience in my journal. I drew maps, described the landmarks, and noted the points where I had felt most lost. I never wanted to forget the lessons I had learned, the importance of constant vigilance, the humility of being alone in the wilderness, and the raw, unpredictable power of nature. Weeks later, I returned to the mountains, but never to that trail. I stuck to marked paths, trails maintained and patrolled, the ones familiar to other hikers. But every time I closed my eyes at night, I could see that ledge, hear the snapping branches, feel the darkness pressing down on me. It had been terrifying, but I survived, and in surviving, I learned something vital. Respect for the wilderness isn't just about knowledge or preparation. It's about understanding your own limits, your own vulnerability, and the quiet, persistent danger that exists even in a forest that seems still. I had been planning the hike for months, watching maps, reading trail guides, and checking weather patterns. I wanted a challenge, a long, isolated trail that few people attempted. That summer, I found a trail that wound through a dense forested range, rising into steep hills and rocky outcrops. The trailhead was almost 2 hours from the nearest town, a place so remote that the mobile signal disappeared as soon as you left the road. I told myself that the isolation was part of the appeal, that this was the kind of hike where I could test my limits and immerse myself fully in nature. I packed carefully. My backpack was heavy with essentials. Plenty of water, high-calorie food, first aid kit, flashlight with extra batteries, rope, a compass, map, and a small multi-tool. I wore sturdy boots, thick socks, and layers of clothing suitable for the sudden shifts in mountain weather. I left the trailhead at dawn, when the mist still clung to the forest floor, and the air smelled damp and earthy. The first few hours were beautiful. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in golden shafts, and the sound of birds punctuated the quiet. I walked briskly, following the trail markers carved into tree trunks and painted on rocks, confident in my navigation skills. By mid-morning, I had already crossed a small stream and climbed the first steep slope. My legs ached slightly, but I didn't mind. Hiking alone meant I could move at my own pace, stop when I needed, and take the trail in fully. I stopped briefly to drink water, leaning against a thick pine tree. That was when I first noticed something odd. Footprints in the soft mud along the trail. They were not human. I examined them carefully. They were large, wider than a man's foot, with deep impressions as if something heavy had pressed into the ground. The toes weren't human either, more like a paw, but larger than any dog or wolf I had ever seen. I froze, staring at the prints. My heart beat faster, not out of fear but curiosity. I followed the trail a little further, my eyes scanning for signs of the animal. The prints disappeared after a bend, and the forest returned to its usual quiet. I shook my head. Maybe a bear, I thought. Not unusual for this area. I continued, trying not to dwell on the tracks. The trail steepened, weaving through dense underbrush and rocky paths. Around noon, I stopped on a flat outcrop to eat a snack and rest. The view was incredible. The valley below was dotted with rivers that glinted in the sunlight, and the hills stretched into the horizon, layered in green and gold. I felt a strange sense of freedom, an isolation so complete that it almost felt like stepping into another world. But I also noticed how quiet it had become. No birds, no rustling in the trees, no wind, just the faint sound of my own breathing. After eating, I pushed on. The trail became narrower, and the trees older, their trunks thick and twisted. Fallen branches littered the path, and moss covered the rocks, making every step cautious. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a section where the trail followed a ridge. One side dropped sharply into a rocky canyon. The other climbed gradually into thicker forest. I walked carefully, holding onto roots and rocks to stabilize myself. Then I noticed it again. A sound, faint but distinct. A low, steady thump, like heavy footsteps, moving parallel to my path but just out of sight. I froze, listening. The sound stopped when I stopped. I waited for several minutes, heart pounding, but nothing emerged from the trees. I tried to reason it out. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe my mind was playing tricks. Still, the feeling of being watched settled in my chest like a weight. I decided to keep moving, faster now, scanning the forest on either side. The ridge ended, and the trail descended into a thick grove of conifers. The ground was softer here, covered in needles, and my boots sank slightly with each step. I noticed more prints, this time fresher. They were the same as before, large, heavy, not human. They crisscrossed the trail, sometimes leading into the undergrowth, sometimes following it. I didn't want to panic, but a knot of fear twisted in my stomach. I increased my pace, gripping my flashlight and multi-tool in my hands, though it was still daylight. By late afternoon, I reached a small stream that crossed the trail. I knelt to drink, splashing cold water on my face. The sun was starting to sink, and the forest began to change color, shadows stretching and shifting. That's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. The prints were still here, crossing the stream, leading deeper into the forest. Whatever had made them had been following me, or at least moving along the same trail. I felt trapped. Turning back would be dangerous too. The trail was steep and treacherous, and I had already come so far. I pressed on, trying to keep calm. Soon, I reached a clearing where the trail leveled slightly, and I considered making camp. The day had been long, and I was tired, my legs aching from constant climbing. I found a small patch of flat ground near some trees and rocks, enough space for my sleeping mat and gear. As I unpacked, I kept glancing at the forest edge. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the silence. I tried to convince myself it was just the forest. Birds settling in, wind through the leaves. I ate a small dinner, drank water, and made sure my flashlight and rope were easily accessible. I slept lightly that night, every snap of a twig sending my heart into my throat. Morning came in a gray, misty haze. I packed quickly and resumed the trail. The prints were everywhere now, crisscrossing the path, heading in the same direction. I noticed something else too. Trees that had been broken or scratched, marks on the bark that suggested an enormous animal had passed. The rational part of me said bear, but the size didn't add up. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made the prints had the strength to crush a human, and it had been moving silently alongside me. By noon, I reached a small ridge overlooking a narrow valley. The trail descended sharply, and the rocks were slick from morning dew. I moved carefully, testing each step before committing my weight. That's when I saw it. Not clearly, but enough to make me freeze. A massive shape, darker than the forest, moving through the trees below, just out of sight, but unmistakable. It wasn't running. It wasn't chasing. It was following, always keeping a distance, shadowing my path through the trees. My pulse raced. Every survival instinct screamed at me to retreat, but the trail didn't offer an easy way back, and the shape stayed below, hidden in shadows. I decided to push on, moving faster, eyes darting constantly. I took care to stay on the trail, avoiding underbrush and loose rocks. The afternoon stretched endlessly. Each bend in the trail, each ridge I crossed, the shape remained, keeping a distance, silent but present. I rationed my water, knowing I might be out here for hours. My legs burned, my back ached from the pack, my hands scraped from gripping roots and rocks, but I could not stop. By late afternoon, I reached a part of the trail that ran along the side of a cliff. The drop was sheer, the rocks jagged and dangerous. My boots slipped several times, and I had to cling to roots and ledges to maintain balance. Below, the forest stretched into a green sea, and I glimpsed the shape again, moving steadily among the trees. I realized then that it had been following me all along, not attacking, just tracking. My mind raced with possibilities. Bear, wildcat, some unknown animal. But fear and exhaustion made reasoning difficult. The sun was low now, casting long shadows. I spotted a series of switchbacks leading down to a lower section of the trail that I recognized from the map. I forced myself to move slowly but steadily, testing each step, holding onto rocks and roots, breathing heavily. The shape below seemed to sense I was approaching a more open area. It paused occasionally, as if studying me. I kept my multi-tool in hand, ready, though I knew it was useless against something this large. Eventually, I reached the bottom of the ridge and a wider, flatter section of trail. Relief surged through me, though my legs trembled from fatigue. I took a long drink of water, and that's when I noticed something. The prints stopped. The last set led to a thick clump of trees and then vanished. I scanned the forest, heart pounding, but the shape was gone. Silence returned, heavy and complete, broken only by distant bird calls and the rustle of leaves. I walked carefully, still alert, but the tension began to ease. I reached a stream where I could refill my water bottles and rest. I sat for a long while, leaning against a tree, muscles stiff, mind racing. I realized that the animal had not attacked me, had only observed, perhaps curious or cautious, but I had no proof of its intentions. Whatever it had been, it was powerful, intelligent, and perfectly adapted to the forest. By evening, I reached a trail junction that led back toward civilization. I had always loved hiking, the quiet isolation of the trails, the smell of damp earth, the sound of leaves shifting in the wind, the distant call of birds. That morning, I left my apartment with a heavy backpack, full of supplies, expecting nothing more than another long, solitary hike in the mountains that rose sharply outside my town. The sky was overcast, the clouds low, dark, and threatening rain, but I didn't mind. I had hiked in worse weather before. The trailhead was nearly empty, save for a couple of cars parked far off in the lot. I tightened the straps of my pack and set off, boots crunching on the gravel. The path quickly narrowed into a single track winding into the dense forest. Pine and spruce towers loomed overhead, their needles forming a thick carpet underfoot, muting my steps. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint smell of moss and rotting wood. I breathed deeply, savoring the crisp forest air, unaware of the tension that would slowly creep into every step I took that day. At first, the hike was uneventful. I kept a steady pace, my legs moving on autopilot, my mind wandering through the familiar rhythm of walking, breathing, and listening. Occasionally, I paused to admire the view through gaps in the trees, valleys stretching below, rivers glinting like silver threads. Birds darted between branches, and somewhere nearby, water trickled over rocks in a small stream. After about 2 hours, the path began to climb sharply. Roots and rocks forced careful footing. My breathing grew heavier, sweat soaking the back of my shirt despite the chill in the air. I felt a strange sense of isolation begin to settle in. The forest, dense and quiet, had swallowed all signs of human presence. No distant voices, no cars, no laughter, only the sound of my own movement. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the exertion and the shadows playing tricks in the overcast light. By the time I reached the ridge, clouds had thickened, turning the light to a dull gray. I stopped to rest, leaning on my hiking poles, drinking water, and scanning the valley below. Everything looked the same, familiar but eerily quiet. I had expected some hikers to be on the trail, someone in the distance, a bird startled into flight, but the forest seemed abandoned. I continued along the ridge. The trail became less defined, narrower, with jagged rocks jutting from the earth and tangled roots threatening to trip me with every step. My pack felt heavier with each hour. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I registered that the air felt colder, the light dimmer, but I pushed the thought aside, telling myself I just needed to keep moving. Around midday, I reached a fork in the trail. A signpost stood crooked and weathered. One path led down into a shadowed valley. The other continued along the ridge, which appeared even steeper and rockier. I chose the ridge, thinking it would give better views and be easier to navigate than descending into thick shadows. Looking back, that decision would haunt me more than any thought of ghosts ever could. The ridge was treacherous. Loose stones crunched underfoot, and steep drops lined the side. I had to concentrate on every step, sometimes using my hands to steady myself against rocks. The wind picked up, cold and biting, whipping at my jacket, making the loose branches sway and creak. With each gust, the ridge felt more precarious, more exposed. I kept moving, reminding myself that I had been on challenging trails before. I was strong, careful, prepared. As I climbed higher, the clouds descended further, thick and gray, reducing visibility to a few meters. The world beyond the ridge vanished into a blur of white and gray. The trail became less obvious, the rocks slick with moisture, and a growing unease settled in my chest. I began noticing the silence in a new way. No birds, no wind rustling the trees below, only the sound of my own breathing and the occasional small rock tumbling down the slope. By mid-afternoon, I had reached a section of the trail that required careful scrambling over steep, jagged rocks. My hands were scraped and bleeding, my knees bruised, but I kept going. I could feel fatigue creeping in, every muscle in my body screaming for a break. My legs trembled, my heart raced, yet I pressed on, unwilling to stop when the summit seemed so close. It was then I noticed something unusual. There were footprints in the mud near a pool of water collected between the rocks. They were human, fresh, pointing back down the ridge. My heart skipped. It wasn't unusual to see other hikers, but the prints were large, heavy, and deep. Someone much bigger than me had passed here, alone. A chill ran down my spine. I rationalized it. Maybe it was just a hiker ahead of me turned back, or maybe someone had camped here recently. I shook my head, trying to focus, but I couldn't help feeling like the forest had grown more oppressive. The wind rose sharply, howling across the ridge. Dark clouds pressed down from above, and I felt a sudden, sharp drop in temperature. My fingers and toes grew numb, despite gloves and thick socks. I considered turning back, but the ridge seemed endless, and descending would require retracing the dangerous path I had already climbed. My sense of direction wavered under the gray haze. I pressed on. Hours passed, though I had lost track of time. The trail seemed endless, winding up jagged rocks, over ridges, and along narrow ledges with sheer drops. My legs were weak, my hands raw from clutching the rocks. Every shadow seemed heavier, every sound amplified. Rocks shifting under my feet sounded like avalanches, branches breaking in the distance like something moving just beyond sight. I kept moving, forcing myself to focus on one step at a time. By late afternoon, the storm began in earnest. Rain started as a fine mist, turning quickly into a driving downpour. The rocks became slick, and water pooled in the shallow depressions along the trail. My pack absorbed some of the rain despite being waterproof, and my clothes became soaked, clinging uncomfortably to my skin. The wind howled, threatening to knock me off balance, and my hands were numb, making it difficult to grasp my hiking poles. I realized I had underestimated the ridge. It was no longer a trail. It was a perilous path along sheer rock faces, with drops on either side. One misstep could mean a fall that no one could survive. Fear gripped me, tight and choking, yet I had no choice but to continue. Turning back would be nearly impossible in the storm, the ridge slick and treacherous behind me. Then I noticed it, a small rock ledge jutting out over a steep drop. It was barely wide enough for my boots. I tested it carefully, feeling it shift slightly under my weight. My stomach twisted with fear. One wrong move and I could tumble down hundreds of feet. But there was no alternative. The trail vanished behind me into mist and rain, and ahead was the only way forward, a thin line of wet stone clinging to the mountain. I moved slowly, one careful step at a time, heart hammering in my chest. Rain stung my face and my vision blurred. A rock beneath my left foot shifted, and I nearly lost my balance. My hands scrabbled for purchase, scraping again, blood mixing with rain. My heart raced, adrenaline surging. I forced myself to breathe, slow and controlled, focusing only on the next step, the next secure handhold. It felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, before the ridge widened slightly, giving a small reprieve. I collapsed against a rock, gasping, body trembling from exhaustion and fear. My clothes were soaked, my hands cut and bleeding, and my muscles ached with the strain of the climb. The storm continued, though slightly less intense, and I realized I was completely alone. No one else was on this ridge. No one could help me if I fell. The isolation, the raw danger, made my chest tighten with anxiety. Eventually, the ridge ended at a small plateau, partially protected by a natural overhang. I collapsed again, leaning against the rock, trying to recover. I realized I had been hiking for nearly 12 hours since leaving the trailhead. My water was low, my energy nearly gone, and I knew I had to find shelter or a way down before nightfall. The storm continued to lash the mountain, and I knew descending in the dark, on slick rocks, could be fatal. I scanned the area and spotted a narrow gully leading down from the plateau. It looked dangerous, but less so than continuing along the ridge in the storm. Carefully, I navigated the descent, sliding and scrambling over wet rocks, testing each foothold before committing weight. My muscles screamed in protest, my fingers numb and slick, but I refused to stop until I reached more stable ground. Hours later, exhausted, battered, and drenched, I finally reached the base of the mountain. The storm had eased, and the forest looked less menacing in the dim evening light. I collapsed near a stream, water flowing past my boots, and allowed I never thought a hike could turn into something that would haunt me for months afterward. I had always considered myself careful, prepared, and logical. Hiking was my escape, my way to disconnect from the chaos of work, people, and city life. The mountain I chose that day was somewhere I had never been, far from the usual trails I frequented. It was called Black Pine Ridge. On the map, it didn't look particularly treacherous, but it promised isolation, long stretches of unbroken forest, and a ridge that cut through the peaks like a jagged knife. I liked that. I wanted to challenge myself. I wanted quiet. I started early in the morning, just as the sun was touching the tips of the trees with golden light. The air was crisp, cold enough to make my lungs feel clean and open. My pack was heavy but balanced, filled with water, food, a first aid kit, extra clothing, and a flashlight just in case. I wore a thick jacket, hiking boots that had seen better days, and gloves that were already fraying at the fingertips. The trailhead was quiet, almost eerily so. No cars in the lot, no other hikers, just the sound of wind through the pines. At first, the hike was beautiful in the way all early hikes are. The forest was dense and dark, shadows stretching across the path like fingers. The ground was covered in a mixture of pine needles and fallen leaves, and my boots crunched against the soft earth as I walked. Birds chirped here and there, and somewhere distant, the occasional rush of water hinted at a stream. The air smelled of pine, wet earth, and something else, something faint and musky I couldn't place. I didn't think much of it. Hours passed as I ascended the ridge. The incline grew steeper and the trail narrower. Rocks jutted out of the ground at awkward angles, forcing me to step carefully. I noticed that the forest was getting quieter. Birds had stopped singing, and even the wind seemed to falter when I thought about it. The quiet was heavier, oppressive almost, like the trees themselves were watching me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it because I was tired. At some point, I took a wrong turn. I didn't notice it at first. The trail had split, and I assumed the narrower path was a shortcut to the ridge. It was not. Within 30 minutes, I realized I was in a section of the forest that didn't appear on my map. The trees were older here, gnarled and twisted, and the underbrush thick enough that it scraped against my legs as I pushed through. I kept moving forward, thinking I could reconnect with the main trail, but the forest seemed endless. Every time I stopped to look around, the path I had taken disappeared behind me. It was disorienting. Then I heard it, not loud, not obvious. A low rustling, but not from the wind. Something moving deliberately through the underbrush. I froze. My pulse picked up and I scanned the area. There was nothing visible, just the shifting shadows of the trees. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or another animal, but the sound didn't match. It was heavier, deliberate, too cautious to be a deer. I quickened my pace, trying to get back to the main trail, telling myself I had been careful before, and now I was just lost. I realized then that I had no sense of direction. The sun had moved higher, filtering through the canopy in patches, but there were no clear landmarks. The forest had swallowed everything familiar. I started keeping my flashlight ready, though it was still daylight. Every step I took felt louder than it should, my boots pounding against the earth, my breath coming fast. I could hear the rustling again, always just behind me, sometimes to the side. I never saw anything, but I could feel it. Hours passed. I tried to retrace my steps, but quickly learned it was useless. Every tree looked like the last, every incline like the previous. My water was running low, my food untouched because I was too tense to eat. The shadows grew longer as the sun started to fall. I realized with a sick feeling that I would not reach the ridge before dark. Panic started creeping in. I found a small clearing, just enough to set my pack down and take stock of my supplies. The clearing was oddly bare, as if no one had been there in years. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that if I stayed put, I could wait for someone to find me. But I had no cell service, no way to signal for help, and the idea of spending the night there filled me with dread. I decided to keep moving, hoping to find a stream or a landmark. As I moved, the rustling got closer. Every so often, I could swear I saw a figure moving between the trees, just at the edge of my vision. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. I couldn't run. The underbrush was thick, and the ground uneven. I had to keep moving slowly, carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible. Then I stumbled over something. My flashlight swung wildly, and for a brief moment, I saw it. A large animal, maybe a bear, retreating into the shadows. I froze, realizing I had been walking in the territory of something dangerous. I had no bear spray, no means to protect myself. My mind raced, thinking of the advice I had read, telling myself to stay calm, to back away slowly, not to run. But fear was suffocating. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, and yet, I had no idea which way to go. I wandered for what felt like hours, slipping over roots and stones, trying to follow any sign of water or a path. Night fell fully. The forest transformed into a living darkness. I could hear the rustling close now, and sometimes the snapping of small branches as something moved. My flashlight was weak, and shadows played tricks on me, turning every tree into a looming figure. I finally stumbled onto a small stream. Relief hit me, but only briefly. I remembered reading that following water downhill could lead to civilization. I followed the stream carefully, keeping low, listening for any movement behind me. My clothes were soaked with sweat and the dampness of the forest. My hands were scratched and bleeding from brushing against branches. Hunger and exhaustion gnawed at me, but the fear of the rustling was stronger. At some point, I tripped again, landing hard on my side. My flashlight went out. I was plunged into total darkness. My hands scrambled for it, my heart racing, ears straining. That's when I heard it clearly. A low growl, close, deliberate. My stomach dropped. I scrambled to my feet, slipping in the mud, and ran blindly along the stream. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but I didn't stop. I ran until I could run no more. I collapsed behind a large fallen tree, shivering, crying, and trying to catch my breath. Hours seemed to pass. I had no idea how long I had been running. My mind was foggy from exhaustion and fear. Then, faintly, I heard something different. A sound of human voices, shouting, calling out. My relief was instant. I screamed back, trying to make myself heard, waving my hands. Soon, lights appeared through the darkness. Hikers, searchers, or perhaps rangers, they had found me. I didn't care. I ran toward them, fell into their arms, sobbing, exhausted beyond belief. They checked me over, gave me water and food, and radioed for further help. I told them everything, the rustling, the darkness, the bear, the terror. They listened calmly, but the look on their faces told me they believed me. Eventually, I was escorted down the mountain, safe. I remember every detail vividly. The smell of the forest at night, the way the shadows moved, the growls and rustlings that kept me on edge. I realized afterward that a wrong turn, a bit of overconfidence, and the isolation had brought me so close to disaster. The experience changed me. I still hike, but never alone. I check and double-check maps, make sure someone knows my route, and carry more than I think I need. I cannot forget Black Pine Ridge, the terror of being lost, of not knowing what was behind the next tree. Even now, when I close my eyes, I see the dark forest, the narrow path, and the shadows that moved with intent, reminding me that nature is beautiful, but also merciless, and sometimes it watches. That night, I learned a lesson about respect, caution, and fear that is carved into my memory. Hiking is not just a physical challenge. It is a confrontation with the unpredictability of the wilderness, where a single mistake can turn beauty into fear and quiet into terror. I had always considered myself someone who enjoyed solitude, someone who could handle the quiet, the isolation, the rawness of the outdoors. I'd done short hikes before, nothing extreme, nothing that scared me. But on this particular weekend, I decided to challenge myself. I wanted a trail that would take me deep into the forest, a place where there were no crowds, no easy exits, no sign of civilization for hours. I found a route online, a remote mountain trail that few people talked about. Only a handful of hikers a year made it through. That was exactly what I wanted. I set off early in the morning, the sun barely breaking the horizon. The air was crisp, sharp with the scent of pine and wet earth from a recent rainstorm. I carried only what I considered essential: a sturdy backpack, water, a few snacks, a map, a compass, a first aid kit, and a flashlight with extra batteries. My boots sank slightly into the soft, damp soil as I started my ascent. The first mile was relatively easy. The path was wide, the incline manageable, and the forest seemed welcoming. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting shifting patterns on the ground. The air filled with the distant hum of birds and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. After about 2 hours, the trail narrowed and became less distinct. The occasional cairn or marker on a tree helped guide me, but I noticed that the path wasn't maintained. Fallen branches and rocks blocked parts of the way, forcing me to scramble over them carefully. My legs began to ache, but there was a thrill in the effort, a sense that I was truly venturing into untamed territory. Around midday, I stopped to rest near a small creek. The sound of water was soothing, a small reward after the relentless climb. I drank some water and ate a granola bar, listening to the forest around me. There was something about this place that felt untouched in a way that was both beautiful and intimidating. I checked my map and realized I was only halfway to the point I intended to reach. That was when I noticed the first unsettling detail. The forest around me had gone almost completely silent. The birds, which had been active in the morning, had vanished. No rustling of small animals, no chirping, no breeze in the treetops. It wasn't a heavy silence, but a sudden emptiness, as if the forest itself had paused. I felt a subtle tightening in my chest, a flicker of unease, but I brushed it off. I reminded myself that it was midday, and many forest animals are quieter during this time. Resuming my hike, I followed the creek for a while, thinking it would lead me to higher ground. The trail became steeper and rockier. My boots slipped occasionally on wet stones, and I had to steady myself with a trekking pole. The sun was starting to dip behind the peaks, but I was confident I could reach my planned campsite before dark. That confidence faded when the trail ended abruptly. I had expected the path to continue, to wind its way upward as indicated on the map, but instead I faced a dense thicket of trees and undergrowth. The trail markers had stopped, and there was no clear way forward. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed different somehow, unfamiliar despite my previous progress. Every rock, every tree, every shadow looked foreign. I checked my compass. My bearing was correct, but the terrain didn't make sense. Then, a faint sound caught my attention, a low, steady crunching of branches and leaves. Not random, not like the scurrying of a small animal, but deliberate. I froze. My heart began to beat faster. I scanned the area, the flashlight still in its holder on my backpack, and used. Whatever it wasn't immediately visible, but the noise persisted, coming closer. My first thought was another hiker, perhaps lost like me, but as the moments passed, the sound didn't stop. It moved slowly but purposefully, as if following me. I didn't panic immediately, but the forest silence now amplified every sound. I could hear my own breathing, my heartbeat, the soft crunch of leaves under my boots. I tried calling out, just to announce my presence, but my voice felt weak, swallowed by the dense forest. The footsteps didn't respond. They continued, slow and deliberate, echoing my movements. I decided to move, to put distance between myself and whatever was behind me. I kept walking, careful not to run, knowing that panicking in uneven terrain was dangerous. As I pushed forward, I noticed the trail markers again, faint markings on trees I hadn't seen before. They weren't official. They seemed carved by a hand, recent and rough. My stomach tightened. Whoever or whatever was ahead had been here before. I quickened my pace, trying to maintain calm while scanning my surroundings. Hours passed. The forest thickened, shadows lengthened, and the sky transitioned into twilight. My water supply was running low, and I hadn't seen a safe spot to set up a campsite. Every clearing seemed exposed. Every tree seemed a potential hiding spot for eyes I couldn't see. The footsteps continued intermittently, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always present. My nerves were fraying. Then I stumbled into a shallow depression, a natural basin that collected rainwater. I paused, leaning on my knees, chest heaving. That's when I saw it. Signs that someone had been here very recently. A partially buried backpack, a makeshift fire pit with charred wood, and footprints leading away. The prints were large, wide, and deep in the soft soil. They were human, but not like any hiker I had seen. They had a heavy gait, and some seemed almost deliberately placed, like someone wanted to be found or wanted me to follow. I realized then that I had two options: stay in place and hope the footsteps never returned, or follow the prints and try to find a more secure location. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I knew running blind in this terrain was reckless. I decided to follow the prints cautiously, keeping to the edges of the forest and avoiding open areas. Every step felt like a test of nerve. My flashlight, now in hand, barely cut through the gloom as the last light faded. The footprints led me to a small clearing surrounded by thick pines. In the center was a shallow, cave-like overhang, just enough to shield me from the wind. I set down my backpack, emptied my remaining water into my mouth, and tried to calm my trembling hands. The sounds of the forest had returned partially, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of small animals, but the unease remained. I spent a long, tense night in that overhang, listening for footsteps, watching shadows, and convincing myself to stay awake as long as I could. Every noise made me jump. The fire pit I discovered nearby seemed abandoned, but I kept glancing at it, expecting it to flare back to life. The night was long, colder than I anticipated, and the darkness oppressive. Yet by dawn, I was alive, my senses sharpened, and a strange clarity settling over me. Morning revealed more about the trail. In the pale light, I could see the path I had taken, winding precariously along rocky ridges and steep inclines. The prints I had followed disappeared somewhere near a small ravine. I didn't see anyone or anything that could have left them, and I realized the forest was a labyrinth. Its features could easily deceive the mind after hours of tension and isolation. I resolved to keep moving, this time more cautiously, following the map but cross-checking every landmark. After several more hours, I finally descended from the higher ridges and stumbled onto a clearer path, a maintenance trail that was part of a longer, known hiking network. Relief washed over me. The air felt different, safer. Birds sang freely. A gentle breeze rustled through the leaves, and the familiar smell of pine mixed with dry earth comforted me. Eventually, I reached the trailhead, where parked cars and a few fellow hikers confirmed that I was out of the wilderness. Looking back once, I saw the mountains rising behind me, mysterious and silent, as though nothing had happened. My backpack was heavier with exhaustion, my legs sore, but the fear and tension that had gripped me for nearly 24 hours began to dissolve. The forest was just a forest, beautiful, harsh, and indifferent. It hadn't wanted to hurt me. It had only challenged me, and I had survived. I left the trail with a sense of respect and caution that I had never felt before. Hiking wasn't just about strength or endurance. It was about awareness, judgment, and understanding the subtle signs the wilderness offered. And though I never discovered the origin of the footprints or the subtle footsteps that had haunted me, I knew one thing. The forest was alive in a way I could never fully comprehend, and survival depended on both courage and care. When I got home, I cleaned my gear, patched my boots, and sat for a long time replaying every moment. Fear had a clarity to it, a sharpness that left no detail unnoticed, and I knew with certainty that I would hike again. But I would never take the wilderness lightly again, Never underestimate the quiet, patient